Joffre, Swait, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the Beauty Through Faith podcast. We've had the pleasure of speaking with you. We've had the pleasure of having you present at our Beauty Through Faith conference in 2025. And I thought it was high time that we check back in with you on your creative work, your curatorial work, life in general, faith, etc. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back. Repeat guest. Am I the first repeat guest? Because that would be an extra honor.
I'll have to go back to the archives. I need to think about that question. You might well be. We have some people who are coming back for repeat, but you might be the first in the rotation. But whether you are or you aren't, we're grateful that you are repeating with us. And I have been following your Substack, Word Hoard, and the work you've been doing since you were with us last fall. Catch us up on several projects. And one of them is a poetry collection of your own work, and one of them is a curation, and I believe it's the start of a body of work that will be curated poetry, if I'm not mistaken. But I'd like to learn more about, first of all, talk to us in the practical terms what you've been up to, and then as usual, we're going to probably dive behind the scenes a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm a juggler of many balls. And I have a media ministry that I oversee. And then I also am an online teacher. So I've been juggling those while working on my creative projects. The anthology that you're speaking of, Word Hoard. So I don't know if you noticed, but my Substack lost the name Word Hoard. I removed it, and now it's just Joffre Swait because I ended up applying it to this project. So this anthology, the subtitle is an anthology of poems every Christian should know. Now, that's highly subjective. It is my opinion because it is curated by me. I am hopeful it'll turn into more than one volume, but it's actually part of a curriculum. So there's a textbook as well that's for senior year of high school, maybe freshman year of college. It's focused on the rhetoric of poetry, so performing poetry out loud, understanding how poetry works in this really physical, embodied way. So I want people to picture it more as a rhetoric curriculum than a poetry curriculum, but it's all through poetry. This anthology accompanies that. I am hopeful that, so this will be of general appeal, right? So there's the curriculum, but you yourself have already picked up a copy or ordered a copy, and you're not in high school anymore. So that's my hope for this. And then my hope is that it'll sell so well that the publisher will ask me about assembling volume 2.
Fantastic. So let's talk about We Bring Pomegranates. So we're going to dive into each separately and have some interesting discussion.
Okay.
But go ahead, tell us about We Bring Pomegranate, and then I'll look back because I want to go to Word Hoard first because it's the first one you brought up, but then I do want to talk about We Bring Pomegranates. So you have a poetry collection. Just give us the précis on that, and then we'll talk.
Yeah. So this collection is actually focused on my community. So I live in the panhandle of Idaho, in Moscow, Idaho. And so the title is We Bring Pomegranates, and the subtitle is simply Poems from Moscow, Idaho. I'm not a particularly pastoral poet. I'm not a landscape poet. I tend to write about ideas and the things I'm reading and the conversations I've had. And so that's what mostly these poems are. The conversations I've had, the sermons I've heard, and some of it is experiential. The one bucolic, pastoral, scenery kind of poem I wrote has turned out that is included in this has turned out to be a favorite. It's called "I Can See the Cascades from Here," and actually, I was on a bus recently with one of my friends. We hit the rise that I had described in the book release. This is the site that inspired that poem. And he said, I can see the cascades from here. So I've got my friends referencing some of these poems. That's got me very excited.
Fantastic. Well, let's go back to Word Hoard. And then I do want to finish with your poetry, but let's talk first the curatorial act. And you say poems every Christian should know. What are the criteria by which you decide a Christian should know a given poem?
Transcendence, truth, beauty, and goodness. So, and I said that as if that were simple, but so obviously a lot of this is subjective. that's inevitable. We are subjective creatures before an objective God. Truth, beauty, and goodness are objective, but we will always experience them as human beings. So, in my small human way, I have made a list of the poems that I find to be most true, good, and beautiful, with a particular view of sanctifying the saint and helping him approach the throne of God through poetry. Now, that doesn't mean that these are all doxological poems. It doesn't even mean that these are all poems by Christians. These are poems that I think, with some help from some editors, are poems that will point people toward truth, beauty, and goodness, and therefore toward God. That I have radically slashed some poets and poems that get included in most anthologies, added a lot of poems that I think will surprise people. They'll discover new poetry through it. But that's not the agenda, right? The agenda is truth, beauty, and goodness. And I think that it has produced an unusual anthology. Lots of poems you'll recognize, but I think almost everyone, lovers of poetry included, will be surprised by several of the selections.
It's a very rich contemplation. What is true, good, and beautiful in poetry? And at Callous Arts, as you know, one of our missions, we want to nurture the voice of the church through the arts. But part of doing that is equipping the saints who are not poets to engage this as an act of formation, as an act of
Yeah.
discipleship, which you've laid out. These poems are ones that aid the journey of sanctification. But it's not simply, they're not included simply because they're useful. They're not didactic in that sense. Maybe talk about, you've told us the criteria. Give us some examples. What is in this word hoard? What could a Christian who purchased this one expect to find? And two, if they bought this volume, how should they approach it?
Mm. One aspect of how this anthology has been put together, and I don't think this my anthology is unique in this aspect that I'm about to describe, but I do think it's one that is often neglected by many anthology creators. Um, it rejoices in the Englishness of English poetry. So I think that sometimes we can tend to have this very numinous idea of what poetry is, when at the end of the day it's language music, and that music can transport you into the transcendent, but it's going to be different in every language. And so one of the things that I've leaned into is the Englishness of English. That has been one of the criteria, kind of under this transcendent vision. But one of the reasons for that is that that is what, um, this is a book for English speakers, and I want them to love their language. And so it's not the utility necessarily of sanctification or of improving your use of the language. Those things are accidents, philosophically speaking, right? Those things will happen. But love, I want to inspire love. And so, yeah, love for Jared Manley Hopkins, love for John Milton, great, but also love for lyric, love for lines. It's just rejoicing in English as English. I forget precisely what the question you asked that got me on this was,
Well,
but I remember there was something about utility, so it's not the utility, it's the love.
Well, you touch on how you made these choices, and in the process of engaging this poetry, love of language is something that holds it together. And that as a curatorial perspective, it's an interesting one because you're a polyglot. You're fluent in multiple languages. So in Portuguese, you would have if you applied a similar logic, clearly translated versions of those wouldn't suffice to represent what you intended for a Portuguese poem collection. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is right, and I hope that the fact that I do speak other languages gives me a perspective into the poems that I've put into this collection that I'm providing for people, and I think that the Englishness of it, I think people are going to notice this. So Milton and Hopkins particularly are poets that people recognize as, wow, they weren't bound by the Greek and Roman and eventually Italian and Spanish ways of doing things. Weren't bound by French ways of doing things. They saw English for what it was and wanted to play with that. The collection is playful. There are a lot of poems that are, I think particularly when readers look at the Elizabethans, but really throughout the collection, they're going to be surprised at how much it looks like what we consider modern poetry. Playful line breaks, experimentation. There's a lot more of that than, well, the Enlightenment and pre-romantic stewards of English wanted to allow through their filters, but but they're there, and it's a lot of fun. So there's more play here than you might expect. Guys like Edward Taylor are absolutely crazy, right? So he and it's he's in the collection, and there's a lot of English works differently than this is a hobby horse of mine. I don't want to get into it too much, but English is a stress timed language. It's not a syllable timed language. And that means that its poetry is different from anything romantic or ancient Greek or, a lot of the platforms we've built our poetry on healthily. That combines with this Germanic thing that is just wonderful. I get excited about how awesome English and English poetry is because it's such a unique language for poetry.
When you talk about the curation of works, I love that you have a point of view. I think anthologies that try to be some absolute or impartial view fail on that front. They end up just smuggling in a perspective that's never stated. And I love that your priors are right out front and you have a
Right.
goal. You have a mission in a sense. It's in the title, that poems that every Christian should know. Your expectation is that there's an obligation. So when we approach this volume, you've given us some handholds. It's the Englishness of it. I personally love that. I just read an interesting Substack essay, a lengthy one about the German language and why it became such an incredible instrument for the delivery of certain kinds of poetry and also philosophical thinking. And it has to do with how German constructs differently than English, not any other language. You're touching on the same thing for English. So
Yeah.
let's go to the extreme poles of the word horde. Tell us the one poem that is the cliche. Of course, that's in there. How could it not be? And then the other extreme, which is nobody would expect this to be in a poetry collection that every Christian should know.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe I'll mention a romantic poet. So Shelley has been reduced from what he might be in a lot of these other all-encompassing anthologies, but Ozymandias is in there, of course. And in the curriculum, there's a second Ozymandias. I don't know if you know this, but so Ozymandias is that poem that starts, "I met a traveler in an antique land," right? So Shelley had a friend who they had a contest to write about the same thing and see who could get published first, and Shelley won. But they both got published. So in the curriculum, both those poems are kind of held up side by side. In the anthology, there's just Shelley. So Ozymandias, I would say. My daughter was surprised and delighted to find Thomas Traherne included in the collection. So Traherne and Taylor, both 17th century Puritans, Church of England, both kind of wild and didn't publish while they were living. Came to prominence in the 20th century. So Thomas Traherne was known for his theological work. Taylor was a backwoods pastor in frontier Massachusetts. But yeah, so both of them have some pretty wild stuff, and it's included in the collection.
So as part of this, when I get my copy, I ordered it. I haven't received it yet, and I am very much looking forward to it. We get not only a view of English language, but we get a view of English language through the eyes and ears of Joffre Swait. And you've said that the beauty of the language and the sublimity or the spirituality of the themes come together and make this required reading for Christians. And I think then let's take a minute of discipleship for those people who think believers, they desire God. We know that we even heard in the Beauty Through Faith conference from our friend Junius, Dr. Junius Johnson, some really helpful understanding of the nature of beauty and
Hmm.
how it invites to us, it speaks to us, it draws us. But I'm a Christian who had a normal education. I don't have a lot of language experience. I speak English. I want to have this experience. W- help me lean in. Maybe I don't even know what Ozymandias is, except that it was the title of a Breaking Bad episode.
Right.
Maybe that's about where it ends. Help me enter. I'm just a novice and I've never experienced poetry, but you're now inviting me to do that, and it's my
Yeah.
first time.
Well, I love that you brought up the idea of a definitive anthology, right? And so I have an entire shelf of anthologies. So not this one, not that one, but the third one behind my microphone is all anthologies. Some are great, some I don't even like, but I own them because I think owning anthologies is awesome. So as you said, I have this agenda. I've stated my mission, right? Sort of right there, and it's declared. There shouldn't be such a thing as a definitive anthology. There are lots of collections that people have put together, and I would like this to be one. I would like it to be your favorite, but I also would like for there to be a volume two, right? So it's already not definitive. The anthology is itself an experience, and one of the things I say in the introduction to the anthology is that I I discourage people unless they know that this is what they love to do. Don't pick up this thing and read it from front to back, right? Let it be a companion. Let it be in the house, right? So rather than be a book that you acquire, you read, and then you put it down or give to a friend. No, let it live in your house. Possibly even have it, serve some time as some bathroom reading, right? But let it be in your house, and don't feel just flip through. Decide that some of these poems aren't for you. Well, my favorite anthology before I made this one was the 1918 Oxford Book of English Verse, and I spent my teenagehood flipping through that book constantly. I had my favorites, and I had entire sections that I definitely was not interested in. Now, I hope that for a Christian picking this up, that nearly all the poems will be poems that they are delighted by. But I also know how anthologies work, and I want people to embrace that. You're gonna have your favorites. You're gonna have the poems you read 20 times in a month, and a poem you never want to read again, and that's all right. So just find the things that delight you within it. Let it hang out in the house with you. So that's the main way I would recommend that people take. Like, don't treat it as some sort of, this is my ushering into the kingdom of poetry and I'll be certified now. No, hopefully this is more, this, I've been invited into a feast, and this feast goes all night.
A good way to think about it, that it's a repast that spans weeks, months, years, because this is the collected genius of centuries. So why should we
Right.
assume we could sit down in a single sitting and receive that? It would be impossible. And each
Right.
poem, if it has the impact that you intend, will have its own space that's necessary to absorb it. But I want to ask a little bit more pragmatic question. That's lovely. Okay, you've told me not to sit down and read it, but I'm a Christian. I'm not even sure I could read a single poem and get through it,
Mm-hmm.
because my phone is going to flash, or I'm going to be thinking, I don't even know what these words mean, or these spellings are
Yeah.
strange. What are there some practical handholds that would invite someone in? Um, to the experience, to be able to arrive at the place that you want them to receive this.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is to read out loud. So I have avoided overly dense poetry. Um, so I hope I've chosen a lot of lively verse. Now, uh, I did include some longer, slower ones, like Coleridge's desultory poem, a desultory meditation, and that thing is several pages and it goes kind of slow. But I don't think it's heavy. Now, most of the poems are just a few lines, and the language is lively. So some poems will be easier than others. But look for some short poems and read them aloud. And they'll be scattered throughout the book. There is there's a period in uh, the 1700s where a lot of use of English got heavy, and the poetry got heavy, just language wise. And there's a lot less of that in this anthology because I wanted this to be light. So yeah, I would encourage such a reader to look for poems that are 6, 8, 10 lines and read them aloud. A good example might be Tennyson's well, break, 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 or the eagle. I'll read the eagle. You've likely heard this before. He clasps the crack. He clasps the crag with crooked hands. Close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. That's it. That's the whole thing. And even though I stumbled on it at the beginning, like this is something that when you read it aloud, the poetry will impose itself on your being, and you'll begin to get a sense for what poetry is.
One of the things I love about your point of view on this, Joffrey, is that uh, the embodied nature of poetry, it is not just simply the presentation of words to the intellect, but poetry is word music. I think that phrase you used earlier is quite powerful. And that the speaking of these words and the shaping of those consonants and vowels with your own lips are part of the encounter that someone could have and make. I think the best art enables the receiver of it to find themselves in it and to make it their own personal property, that it's their own.
Yes.
It is somehow, the term I've been using to talk about this is it's a form of a scaffolding that one soul offers to another and says, here's some scaffolding upon which you can hang your own lifetime, upon which you can hang your own encounters, your own experiences, and it will hold you up. It will offer you structure for your own experience. Does that connect some of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have become accustomed to, in all art forms, to being stonewalled. And of course, for any generous artist, which is to say any good artist, any generous artist must recognize that there are certain things that are going to be more high or more low, more folksy or more elevated, and that's something to be embraced, right? There's a folk ballad, and then there's Mozart, and we can embrace that. But what we've become accustomed to is obscurity for obscurity's sake, right? And works of art that do not provide any handholds, even for the earnest seekers. There is poetry like that. And in the last century, there was a lot of it, but that sort of person has always existed, and other poets have made fun of them with their with their poetry. But so I have striven to find poems that are generous in that sense. And when you have that, when you have poems that were written not to impress people, but as gifts, as acts of generosity, then that the reader and the speaker of those poems is going to end up with a sense of ownership, as you say. That's what happens with a gift. When someone gives you something, you have it now, and so that is my favorite. Right, that's my favorite hymn. That's my favorite painting. That's my favorite poem, and it's a list of that's my favorite poems.
What a powerful image that is. And I'd never have heard it worded so concisely, Joffrey, that when the artist creates, the artist of good intentions is giving a gift. And it is true that that gift once received isn't a transaction that closes. But in a sense, it's an invitation to a life that is changed. And I wrote a little blurb for our Kalos blog a couple months ago. I was reading the Space Trilogy of C.S. Lewis, having never read it, and knowing it was one of his more perimeter works in his corpus, but was curious and had heard some interesting things. And it's in the first one, Out of the Sonnet Planet. One of the characters, it's about a paragraph, just talking about the nature of lived experience. And C.S. Lewis is talking about this Martian puzzling at a human's need to revisit sexual encounters. It has to do with reproduction and some of this, and the human character is saying, well, you have something good. Why don't you want to just keep going back and keep going back? And the Martian's mystified, not being subject to the fall. It's mystified and saying, but when you've had the experience, it's only just begun. That moment is the beginning of the experience. And it
Yeah.
painted a picture, suggested this picture of uh, if you had still water in a container, and the minute you touch the water, those ripples continue long after you even see the last of them. It's still occurring, that wave motion in that water. And in a sense, a gift of art received, that's the beginning of experiencing the art. True for a piece of music, true for a poem. And I think you've said that beautifully. That then is a gift. It's a gift for a lifetime.
Yes. Well, I love that you said transformation because so one of the themes we've been working around is transcendence. So then thinking about that moment in Out of the Silent Planet. I mean, if a poem has led you to quote the last poem, the last line of the last poem in this anthology, reach out and touch the face of God. Like if that's what has happened, you will never be the same again. And it may be in the mildest of ways, right? But it's really wonderful to think of this idea of having been transformed and how radically that moves us away from a consumerist idea, right? Like I've digested the top 500 poems, right? That's the name of an anthology, a good anthology that I own. Top 500 poems. That's pure marketing. And that's not what art is supposed to do, right? And so I love this idea of transformation that you're mentioning. And if the transformation is because of some sort of transcendence, because one of the other things that Lewis talks about in speaking of human relationships, like we will never meet we will never meet a mortal human, right? Everyone is eternal and has eternal significance. So our spouses, our children, our enemies are all eternal beings, and so are poems, right? And so just to have that, and to have a meeting with one that actually connects you to something transcendent, that's mighty. We're just not equipped to handle the mightiness and the transformationness of our lives. We flatten everything because it's more than our minds and our spirits can handle. But it's out there, like this the possibility of eternal transformation all the time by everything around us is out there.
I can't let this observation you made go without commenting on it. It's a little off topic, but boy, is it juicy. The idea, and C.S. Lewis does this so well, surface these profound things in very compact ways. And to know that as we encounter people in our lives, every one of them is eternal. And he said as much, but the corollary to that then, to think that poetry or the investment of life, that we read these poems, we share these things, we share artwork, it's shaping an eternity of impact through
Yeah.
another life. And so this gives us an opportunity to turn from your anthology to your own poetry, that you are giving gifts in We Bring Pomegranates. I'd love for you to just start by sharing a poem, and maybe it is I your poem about seeing the Cascades, and talk about that, or one of your choosing, so that anyone who hears this podcast will at least have encountered one of your gifts. And encountering that, you will have influenced something of eternity through that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Yeah, so let me bring that poem up on my screen, I think is what I'll do. I can see the Cascades from here. And it's dedicated to three men that I have experienced Eastern Washington and the panhandle of Idaho with. So it's dedicated to Austin Anderson, Will Boyd, and Hugh Powell. And Austin Anderson is actually the dude I was on the bus with yet again, who, when we crested a hill, looked at me significantly and said, I can see the Cascades from here. So I'm just glad my friends hear my poetry. Well, here it is. Postcard hills roll past us uniformly, waving weetly as they wind their highways over gentle swells, through tiny valleys, tucked between the leaping crests and cleavage, plunging where naturally the eye would flow. Pools of people gather in basin towns. Milkers these are, like ants on aphids, stroking the land until she droplets squeezed grain from out her mounds, round after round, out-rippling rank on rank, the rolling waves outgang, each a glory, each a glory, each somehow the same, a glory, a postcard. We drive setwise, Kingfisher in and out of little clefts and hamlets, hidden towns. West of Palouse, an impossible valley appears. Between each breast it's cooler, more varied the life. White-barked birch and sun-bright yellow aspen, weeping willows sweeping wooded waters. We're now past Colfax Airport, at World's Edge. Lentils End and cataclysmic scablands begin. We crest, and I can see the Cascades from here, snow-capped in May, beyond even the ranches and cherry branches of watered sagebrush steppes. The day is clear, and I can see the Cascades from here.
That's beautiful. The imagery in that is so rich. If I'm not mistaken, if I heard you correctly, you used kingfisher as a verb.
Yes.
I love that. Love that idea. A poetic license, as they say. Talk to us about the inspiration. I mean, I've been in that part of the country. I had a family who lived there. I've driven it. I can picture precisely what you're describing.
Wonderful.
Which is amazing. What is the significance of that moment as you come to that last valley you describe, and then you see the snow-capped moments? That is where the poem leads. Take us through the journey in your own you have given us your own words, but give us the layperson's view of that.
Well, there are two big inspirations in my drives around the Palouse. One is heading north out of Moscow towards Spokane. Every time I need to fly, I have to drive up to Spokane, to the airport there, and out past. So this region is this microclimate, geological region is called the Palouse. But there's a town called the Palouse in the state of Washington, and we drive through it on the way to Spokane. And just outside of that town is this perfect little river valley that is just it's kind of trapped in stone, but it's wide, and it's got just lush grass and willows and cattle through it, but you can't see it except for a half-mile bend, right? And you don't see it when you're in town, and you don't see it half-mile out of town, but it's just this gorgeous valley. The other inspiration is driving west out toward the Cascades for rugby. Several times a year, as a coach of a high school team, we would drive out toward the Cascades or to the Cascades, occasionally even to Seattle. But as you're leaving the Palouse, there's a little trend. So the Palouse is these gentle rolling hills that look exactly like that old Windows background. I actually looked it up because people often think it's the Palouse. It's some hill in England, but they look exactly like that with the occasional pine tree. But those hills, it looks like the Shire. It looks like a postcard. It's sometimes surreal in how beautiful it looks. And just west is an area called the Scablands, and it's dry and desert and stone, and it's beautiful in its own way. But it's such a difference from this green, fertile Shire land. There is a hill just outside of Colfax, outside of the Colfax Airport, where you can see out into these badlands, and you're only a few minutes away from them. And every once in a while, on a perfect day with the sunshine just right and no clouds and no dust from the desert or from the grain harvest in the air, you can actually see the Cascades from that point. So those two places, those two moments inspired me to write this. The truth is, I had to go to those places many, many, many times. and then a poem surged forth. Yeah.
There's one of your word pictures is that of ants and aphids. And to me, this is an example of why poetry is different than reading novels and short stories, because within a very few words and just the selection of a particular metaphor, you're connecting human agriculture and ants and the whole scale differences that we observe, but a unity of structure, a unity of how it all fits together. And the idea of the ants milking the aphids and we're milking the earth for its grain, just for its sustenance, such a beautiful image. And that's just almost on the side of the real journey, which is to this point where you come to the edge of that which is green and hospitable, and you look out on a land that's austere and difficult. And you know, if you continue west, that way becomes very difficult. And before cars, probably a lot of people died trying to navigate. Some of these western deserts are deadly
Yeah.
because they're so vast. But to see the Cascades is the idea that beyond this difficulty, there is yet something greater and higher and worth accomplishing. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, yes, it's a wonderful reading. It is it is something I wonder about how people's response to the poem based on their knowledge of the geography, and how much should the poem have taken up the responsibility to educate people about the regional geography. And and I hope I've communicated that, fertile land, scab lands, and then the Cascades. But if you're actually familiar, as you are, with the region, you understand what an enormous space that is. You should not be able to see the Cascades from Colfax, Washington. But sometimes you can. And so it is actually an enormous distance.
I think it's a beautiful illustration that something that could be a travelogue, which could have a poetic flavor distilled into poetry, shows that the economical choice of language can deliver so much more imagery and emotional impact when thoughtfully crafted than paragraphs would be able to do. But as you said, when we were talking about the anthology, this is not something that you just drive up to a drive up window, order your super happy meal, and move on and you consume it in a bite. This is something that requires of you a little bit of archaeology, a little digging, a
Yes.
little asking questions. Why does this word follow that? Why is kingfisher a verb? Is it even a verb? That itself takes a moment to parse. Oh, wait a minute. Where's the action? If you're even thinking in these terms. So I
Right.
think that the poem is lovely on so many fronts, Joffrey. It's evocative, imagine and an imagined experience. It points to things that are sublime, the nature of our agriculture and how we live together with the land. It asks us to consider language more slowly.
Mm.
Uh, I think it's a perfect case study in what we just talked about, how to approach poetry itself. So talk some more about We Bring Pomegranates. That's a poem that's resonated with me, and I think you posted it on Substack. I remember seeing it and remember it standing out. When you minute you
Yeah.
mentioned the title, I remembered it. Talk about some of the other work in this volume.
Yeah. Well, um, yeah, this region has fascinates me, um, especially having moved here. So I have a Latin American background, and I spent most of my life in the American South. So two extremely different but highly religious societies, right? The sort of places where you can talk about God and where there are churches everywhere. And then I moved to the Pacific Northwest, and I think the West generally is kind of not like that. But the Pacific Northwest has a really wild history in that sense. I think that the way this region was settled, just kind of led to an unchurched area, and what actually ended up happening was a highly cultic area. There are lots of cults in Washington, in Oregon, somewhat in Idaho as well. There was even a local cult here in the 1920s, a mail order cult. So one of the biggest cults in the country at the time, in which its leader. So it was all mail order. You paid a monthly subscription, and you got special knowledge by mail about how to be more fully human and how to be one with God in the cult leader's special way. His last name was Robinson. We actually have a park here in town called Robinson Park. Um, After the United States used the atom bombs, and I'm sorry for laughing. It's just an outrageous idea. He then started, like, his material was suddenly about nuclear power. Like, in our souls, like his material was going to make us like atom bombs, and we were going to be able to channel atomic power through our bodies, right? So that's just the local cult. But any search of Netflix, and just so many of these stories abound through Washington and Oregon. And I think the reason for that is that there's no real religious culture. And so people are on this, that they're looking for anything. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there's actually been a lot of scholarship even recently on this phenomenon in Oregon and Washington. So that is happening. That's the background of the Northwest. And at the same time, I am part of a church that's very missional and very evangelistic, and people are hostile toward us sometimes. And I know from being in this, just in the same tradition in other places, that's not how people have to react. That's not how they do react. It's almost like a regional reaction. And so we bring pomegranates. The message is that these are our weapons. Our grenades are fruit. That's the message of this collection is I love you. Hopefully that's the message. And I want to feed you. So there actually is like the grenades are called grenades because they look like these stone apples. That's actually why they're called that. So my wife made this print of the actual pomegranate. And so, that's the idea. And one of the biggest the longest poem in the collection is actually the first poem. And it is about two men in Moscow, Idaho. One was this cult leader, Robinson, from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, who had to flee to Cuba and needed protection from an Idaho senator and all this crazy stuff. And then an evangelist who I had the privilege of knowing here in town named Jim Wilson, who was a missionary to Japan, met his wife, then was a college minister, and he moved here so that he could be near U of I in Washington State, which is only 15 minutes away. And it sort of just compares the two men and kind of rejoices in the life of Jim Wilson, who just loved Jesus. He was a very straightforward, simple lover of Jesus and wanted to tell people, especially college students, about it. So, yeah, that's maybe more than you asked for, but that's sort of the inspiration behind the book.
So, similar question that I asked on the anthology. Christian wants to enter a specific poet's body of work. Would you have different advice if they took up your volume? Or would you say it's the same process, it's the same engagement? Is there anything additional or different that you would encourage?
No, it's the same process, I would say. I do think that you should always pay attention to in a poet's collection to the first few poems, right? The tendency is going to be like a musician who has put together an album, right? Hey, pay attention to the first couple of tracks, right? But outside of that, I think it's however you want to digest it. And any book that has 30, 40, 50, 100 poems in it. Most I know people who read poetry books front to back. But that's not really how they're designed, and I don't think anyone should feel an obligation to do that. Now, with this collection, the first few poems will definitely kind of set the tone and kind of introduce you into the world that it's written for.
And people should be prepared to read them out loud as they engage them.
Yes, that's right. So I write lyrically, although I wouldn't go so far as to say I write strictly lyrics. But even when you were hearing, I can see the cascades from here. Moments of strong rhythm, but even this a lot of alliteration in those lines. There was no rhyme scheme in that particular poem, but all that alliteration. It'll tickle your brain if you're reading to yourself, but it'll do something in the soul, one hopes, if you read it aloud. Yeah. And reading it aloud actually means you need to slow down. So honestly, I think realistically it's sort of a mix of both. uh you start to realize, oh, I want to read this one aloud. But I'd love if you read every single one aloud, but being awake to the possibilities of what would happen if I read this one aloud, and then, yeah, you know what, I want to hear this one.
I think with the internet culture, and I know I fall into this trap maybe more than many, of of operating in the realm of idea and word, reading things. One thing I tend to dislike, oddly enough, we're on a podcast, but I tend to avoid video formats for learning things and others as popular as YouTube is, and maybe a generational thing. But what you've encouraged me to rethink, and I welcome this, by speaking poetry, one, you slow down, and you're not slowing down necessarily so you understand better, although that may happen. But there is also a reality that part of the poetry, particularly your work and how you've curated Word Hoard, the forming of words itself is a physical act, and we are embodied souls. We are not just simply souls. The horrible phrase meat puppet and these other things you hear on the internet, which are just absolutely defacing. They misunderstand the nature of bearing God's image. It enacts the fullness of God's image when we participate with our body. And poetry is not something that I usually think about being participatory. I love that you've invited us to do that with our bodies,
Yeah.
not just our minds.
Right. And when you say participatory, you're speaking of putting the words into your own mouth and pushing them out with your own lungs. But I will mention that I've recorded an audiobook version of There Will Be Pomegranates, or We Bring Pomegranates. Wow, those are two such different titles. Yeah, We Bring Pomegranates. So there's an audiobook, and it's available on my Substack. So I have a link to my shop there. So you can just get the recording and just listen to it yourself. And with the anthology, so I'm recording an audio version of the entire anthology. But as I record it and I post it for the publisher to grab the poems, I spoke I cleared it with my publisher. I mean, they're not his poems or my poems, but I'm just going to be posting these poems as I read them aloud on my Substack. So the audio files are just going up. So you actually can listen to every single one of these poems and hear the music of them, at least as I interpret it. So listening. I think viewing is actually a lot more complicated than a lot of people assume. And, but of course, I think a lot of YouTube videos don't actually get watched. They get listened to, right? People put them on and walk away. And then, they come back and they see their friends in the podcast on camera, but then they go back into the kitchen or whatever. Anyway, these poems are out there to be heard. And then, I think that can even make it easier for you to read them yourself. You hear someone else read it and, oh yeah, I get the feel for this. If you're a novitiate in the world of poetry.
I think that's an invitation also to one other thing. As a musician, I believe deeply, and I think it's true of poetry at least as much, if not more so, that you cannot you cannot receive one of these art forms on a single listening, on a single encounter. You must give it at least twice, two readings,
Yeah.
two recitations, and maybe there's a scenario where people can have you as a companion and they hear it and then they read it aloud. And I'm trusting and I'm confident that if people will engage your work and engage the work of this anthology, it will awaken in them perhaps a curiosity and an openness to poetry as a form that perhaps they didn't have before. So I really want to encourage everyone who's hearing this, who are friends of our Beauty Through Faith community, who are lovers of Joffre's work, go secure these resources. I'm looking forward to getting Word Hoard and We Bring Pomegranates. And because you have now walked through it, the meta arc of it, uh, I'll be able to read it more intelligently. And that's part of
Right.
engaging serious work. Sometimes you need to do a little light homework so that you enter it correctly. And you've done our homework for
Yeah.
us, Joffrey. Please summarize then, how do we get a hold of these works?
Actually, the anthology is not available on Amazon yet. My stuff is available on Amazon, but I would prefer if you would check out my shop on my Substack. So Joffrey Swait on Substack. And then Roman Roads Media but I've posted all the links for the anthology and for the curriculum as well. If you're interested in the curriculum, if you're a homeschooling family, or if you're a teacher at a school, or if you just are interested in studying poetry rhetorically and technically, then check out the curriculum as well. So my Substack and Amazon.
And the URL to your Substack is
joffreyswait.substack.com.
And I'm clarifying that because it has changed its name. So I want to make sure we're really clear
That's
where we're going.
yeah.
And that's
Yeah, Word
fantastic.
Hoard is now this.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So Roman Roads Publishing and then self-published on the poetry. I want to encourage listeners or viewers. You're going to spend your money entertaining yourself. That's a certainty in our society. this is an invitation to do so with a thought both to your soul and the nurturing of the voice of the church through the arts. And Joffrey is absolutely one of those voices in our time. Joffrey, thank you so much for being with me on this repeat customer discussion, and we'll have you back again. There's a whole, frankly, a whole other hour that I would love to start to investigate this idea of eternal souls and how we as people in the church engage evangelism, life, and our work in the world. You've got my mind spinning, and I am very eager to have your poetry in my home and on my lips and have a chance to say it aloud. I'm going to take that challenge because I don't read poetry aloud. When I read it and I parse it in my mind, I'm going to take up your challenge, and I'll report back the next time.
I love it. Gustav, thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And I'm looking forward then to our next public conversation.
In fact, I already have it in mind. It could be with some other poets, but I'll reveal that at a later date. Joffrey, thank you for being with us on Beating Through Faith.
Thank you.